Hey, I'm Dylan at Western Bikeworks, and welcome to the 6th installment of WTF WBW, What's the Fix Western Bikeworks, where we take your questions and we answer them, whether they're technical questions or something you just always wanted to know about cycling history, didn't know who to ask. We're your experts. Be sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can submit your question through our YouTube channel, through email, through Twitter, through Instagram, or through our Facebook page. This question this week comes from Ty L, and Ty L has kind of a zinger. He wants to know what are all the different bottom bracket standards and which ones are interchangeable. Opened up kind of a can of worms there, Ty, because bottom brackets, you take 2 of them, put them in a room, come back the next day, like rabbits, there'll be like 10 more. Standards are multiplying, and they used to be component manufacturer driven. Now they're kind of being driven by the frame manufacturer. So we're going to look at the different bottom bracket standards, not all of them because there are a lot more than we have here today, but we'll give you a sampling of those, tell you what you need to know in order to get a proper replacement. The bottom bracket is dependent upon 2 things: the frame and the crankset. The bottom bracket, for those of you who don't know, that's the bearing assembly that the cranks rotate on. So the first thing you need to figure out is the frame. What kind of bottom bracket does the frame require? And there are 2 primary differences. Those are frames that have threaded bottom bracket shells. These are the traditional style where you have to physically thread the bottom bracket into the shell or into the frame. What we're seeing nowadays is manufacturers are moving away from threaded standards and going to what we call press fit standards, where there are no threads at all in the shell, and you're pressing either the bearings directly into the frame in the case of the BB30, or you're pressing some kind of housing that houses the actual bearings into the frame. So this is a PF30. So let's look at the threaded standards first. The width of the shell is something you're going to need to know in order to get a proper replacement for a threaded bottom bracket. 68 millimeters for most road frames, 73 millimeters for mountain bike, 83 for mountain bike, up to 100 for longer travel mountain bikes, some fat bike frames. And that has to do with tire clearance. The larger the bottom bracket shell is, the more real estate you have to attach the chainstays, which means that you can fit a larger tire in there. So you're going to need that. And there have been different threading standards historically. What we call English or ISO has a particular threading standard, and what we call Italian. Italian actually has a 70 millimeter shell, not as common as they used to be, say, in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. Now you need to know what crankset you have, because the bottom bracket is very dependent upon the crankset. The older 3-piece style cranks, where you had the bottom bracket that housed the spindle that the cranks rotated on, was 1 piece, and then the drive side crank and the non-drive side crank were 2 separate pieces, so a 3-piece crank. And you needed to know what kind of interface between the bottom bracket spindle and the crankset you had. This happens to be a Shimano Octolink. There are also what we call ISIS. That's a different spline standard that was adopted by Raceface, FSA, etc. And then there's some proprietary spline standards as well, and also the square taper. That's that older kind of square profiled spindle. And when we move to 2-piece cranks, 2-piece cranks are those in which the spindle is part of one of the crank arms. Can be part of the drive side, can be part of the non-drive side, doesn't matter, but it's one continuous piece. And this 2-piece style crank requires a very specific kind of bottom bracket, a bottom bracket that has a hole through the middle, and that hole has to match this spindle. There are 2 primary types. Shimano has just a straight spindle that's been adopted by FSA and others, and then SRAM Truvative, they use a stepped spindle, which means you have to get a SRAM Truvative specific bottom bracket. You can see that the diameter of the cup here is different on one side to accommodate that smaller or that stepped spindle. Outboard bearing bottom brackets are what we call this because the bearings are actually sitting outside of the frame. That gives wider bearing support, which makes the whole assembly a lot stiffer. So moving to press fit standards, these are ones in which the shell is not threaded at all. Cannondale and others kind of pioneered this. The main difference being that you're pushing the bearings or a housing for the bearings directly into the frame. BB30, the 30 stands for the diameter of the spindle. The diameter of the spindle has now been increased to 30 millimeters from 24 on the older 2-piece cranks. And the idea there is that when you increase it to 30 millimeters, you can start to make the spindle out of aluminum, because aluminum is not a very stiff material. Seems like kind of counterintuitive, but it's not. And in order to allow it to not flex, you have to make it larger diameter. So as soon as you go to 30 millimeters, you can start to make spindles out of aluminum. They're going to be much lighter. So BB30 is a system in which the bearings, bare bearings, are pressed directly into the frame. The width of the shell is the same as what we saw with the threaded, 68, 73, etc., but you're pressing the bearings directly into the frame. PF30 still has a 30 millimeter spindle, but instead of pressing the bearings directly into the frame, you're pressing these sleeves that hold the bearings in place. The sleeves can be metal in the case of this Endura or Wheels manufacturing version. They can be some kind of resin or a Delrin or plastic or something like that, but you're pressing this into the frame, and that allows for a little bit more of variation in the inner diameter of that frame in order to accept these bearings. And then there are lots of other standards that we see that aren't as common. There's BB386 EVO, which is one that uses a 30 millimeter spindle but an 86 millimeter wide shell. There's also one called BB Right that Cervelo has developed, and also Look Bicycles out of France has their own proprietary bottom bracket standard. If you have any questions about compatibility between your bicycle and particular cranks and bottom brackets, make sure you call our customer service staff. We'd be happy to answer any questions. Ty, by virtue of asking that question, you are now in the running for our $50 gift certificate we're going to give away at the end of the month. Appreciate you watching. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Submit your questions through that medium, through our Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or through email. Have any questions? Give us a call or visit us at westernbikeworks.com.